Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this fund drive Saturday, May 16, 2026. Our central theme for today's program is police terror. We also extend our solidarity with our Cuban sisters and brothers alongside all African and indigenous communities worldwide against the great thief of U.S. imperialism. We commence with our sister Luyanda Kuboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, this hour, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Gautham Rao, associate professor of history at American University in Washington, D.C., and editor-in-chief of Law and History Review. He joins us to discuss his book, White Power, Policing American Slavery. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Stuart Schrader, Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University and Director of the Chloe Center for the Critical Study of Racism, Immigration, and Colonialism. He joins us to discuss his book, Blue Power, How Police Organize to Protect and Serve Themselves. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, Dorothy Ashby, Cecil Taylor, Steve Kahn, Nicholas Payton, Jerry Mulligan, Milt Jackson, Alice Coltrane, and more. Our brother Gary Baca, KPFK's program director, joins us this hour to help keep Freedom Now on the air, as we are on Fund Drive, so Gary takes it away, phone in to pledge, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
This is KPFK 90.7 FM Los Angeles. I'm Gary Baca here for Freedom Now, asking you to go to your phone. We are significantly behind in our station's goal, and we're asking you to pledge for Freedom Now with Dr. Gerald Horne, a historian, scholar, talks about the history and discrimination that has plagued America. This can be heard every Saturday from 11 to 12 p.m. When we talk about the meaning of Freedom Now, it represents an urgent, contemporary demand for the immediate reclamation of inalienable human rights, focusing on overcoming systemic oppression, displacement, and the fight for peace. Freedom Now. What does that mean today? The active defense of rights. It's a call to protect individuals from government repression. Donald Trump and the Trump administration. Freedom Now featuring advocacy for those wrongly imprisoned and ensuring human rights are upheld in volatile regions. Freedom from fear. It encompasses freedom from economic insecurity, violence, and the fear of being targeted, allowing people to live without constant anxiety. Freedom is a big word and has a huge meaning. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. That's the number to call to pledge your support. Hit option 2 and that goes to the phone room. And in this way, we keep Freedom Now on the air and we keep free speech alive. Cultural and global action. Freedom Now. It is increasingly expressed through global cross-cultural collaboration to assert that freedom is a universal right, not restricted by nationality or background. Freedom Now, the modern understanding, highlights the need to balance personal liberties, challenging the rise of authoritarian control. Freedom Now is a proactive, often urgent demand for immediate justice, safety, in the face of ongoing real-world threats. 818-985-5735. Keep freedom alive. Keep freedom now. 818-985-5735 in the great work that Gerald Horne has been doing researching the history of racism and discrimination. Who does this but KPFK? I'm Gary Baca, and I'm asking you to go to your phone and please pledge your support. That $25 at $50 goes a long way for racism and discrimination. It exposes the truth, and you hear it here on KPFK. Donald Trump and his henchmen, they're going to be in our spotlight. We're going to be watching them closely. We are not supported by corporate entities, colleges, universities, the federal government. We are Freedom Now, and we are free speech to do what we need to do for the public of Los Angeles and Southern California. So if you want truth to power, if you need the truth, then keep us on the air so that we remain vigilant and resistant. 818-985-5735. Call now. 818-985-5735. Call now for Freedom Now. Do you know the struggle that we had to go through to become free? Especially if you're Black in America, Native American, Mexican, especially Italian, Irish, Scottish. A lot of us are here with backgrounds from different countries, but we created America. We're the ones that built the White House. We're the ones that built mansions from slave labor, stole the land from the Native Americans, and then built homes on slave labor. Does that sound right? Well, hey, it was hundreds of years ago, and let's forget that. Let's forget about reparations. Let's forget about taking care of the Native American people and living close to them, living with them, and learning about the earth, Mother Earth, planting, taking care of it, but instead drilling, contaminating the oceans, the air. I hate to say it, but it almost sounds like corporate America will destroy us. Who else does Trump want to start trouble with? Canada, Mexico, Greenland, China. He's despicable. And I say that because his ratings are low. And most people will probably agree by now. So once again, folks, Freedom Now is a show that runs here every Saturday from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. And it's really important that we get you to the phones right now. Freedom Now. The power or right to speak, act, and change as one wants without hindrance or restraint. Freedom is a right. Freedom to say what you believe in. 818-985-5735.
Forward ever, backwards never. This is Sister Luyanda Koboka with Freedom Now's African Drumbeat Historical Calendar for the week of May 16th. This presentation is to keep the memories of our revolutionary ancestors and positive actions alive in the hearts and souls of our people, to inspire us to greater accomplishments. May 16th, 1966, Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture becomes the chairman of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC, the foremost grassroots organizing effort led by students for the destruction of the de facto segregation and the empowerment of African sharecroppers in the Black Belt South. Stokely's rise heralded the rise of black power as a major ideological stepping stone towards Pan-Africanism. May 16, 1865, Susan Lafeche Picot was born, an Omaha Paiute, the first Native woman contemporary doctor who gave care to all patients without discrimination and banned the sale and consumption of alcohol. She was a lecturer and organizer who drew the links between the European slaughter of the plains buffalo and the destruction of the Native American culture. May 17, 1582, Queen Zinga was born. She was the warrior queen of the Congo and Ndongo, who resisted Portuguese domination of her people. She is considered one of the most remarkable global women of the century. She led resistance against European colonialization for over 50 years. She united the Ndongo, Matamba, Congo, Kasji, Dembos, Kisma, and Central Planalto kingdoms into a Pan-African empire to strengthen African resistance. She declared that all slaves who reached her empire would be free. May 17, 1954. The United States Supreme Court outlaws school segregation in Brown versus the Board of Education, thereby injecting African students into Eurocentric schools, advancing the process of Europeanization of African people. May 18, 1803. Catherine Flon removed the white cloth from the Haitian national flag and sewed in blue and red cloths together to symbolize the unity of blacks and mulattoes, thereby providing a united force against the French. May 18, 1950, Brazilian National Council of Black Women founded by Maria Nascimento. Brazil has the largest population of African people in the Western Hemisphere. May 19, 1874, Inessa Armand was born. She was one of the most important women in the Russian Revolution. She was the president of the Moscow Society for Improving the Lot of Women Fighting the Tsarist feudal regime. She was imprisoned and became a major propagandist in the first modern socialist revolution in the world, who with Lenin and the party built a new social order where the working class became the dominant ruling class. She served as the first director of the women's section in the Central Committee of the Communist Party. May 19, 1925, Alhaj Malik Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, was born. Malcolm X rose from the shattering experience of his father's death by the Ku Klux Klan, then street hustler, and then became the national spokesperson for the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and evolved into a Pan-Africanist guided by the revolutionary leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Touré, and Julius Nyerere. Malcolm X stated that you cannot understand the struggle in Mississippi until you understand the struggle in the Congo, for we have the same enemy. May 20th, 1973. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Sequel El Hamra and Rio Oro, or Polisario, founded to fight for the independence of the Western Sahara in Africa from Spanish colonialism and Moroccan neocolonialism. This has been Freedom Now on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, 98.7 FM in Santa Barbara, where every week is Black History Week. Please, for any comments or contributions, email us at freedomnow@kpfk.org. We will close with a Unity Freedom chant of Amandla, and you respond Awetu. Join us wherever you are for the symbolic show of unity. Amandla!
Awetu!
Amandla!
Awetu!
Amandla!
Awetu!
818-985-5735. The 5 basic freedoms protected by the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution are the freedom of religion, speech, the press, assembly, and the right to petition the government. That's what we're doing. And what are they doing? They're smashing us, smashing windows. If you simply drive away, they'll shoot at your car. Doesn't matter if you have kids in the back seat. Most people are saying, just stay there, get arrested. That's not how we do it in America. That's not how it's done. We already know that there had been deportations in the past through Biden and Obama, and people have their opinion on that. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Freedom now, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from the press. What does that mean? The right for media, newspapers, online news to report information without government censorship. First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Freedom of speech, the right to voice opinions and ideas through words, symbols, or actions. Freedom of religion, the right to believe or not believe in a religion and to practice it freely. Freedom now. Freedom of assembly, the right to gather peacefully in groups. We have a right to do that. That's what freedom's all about. And that's why it's important that Freedom Now stays on the air. Freedom to petition, the right to ask the government to fix problems or make changes. So my people, I'm talking to you. We're fighting the big fight. How about you? You think you can support us in an easy way by pledging your support of $25, $50 for all the volunteers here that keep it going? That money would not go to the volunteers as much as we like to give it to them. It goes to keep the antenna transmitter working properly. A giant transmitter on Mount Wilson from a little radio station that has big topics and big opinions and big facts. 818-985-5735. We are offering Michelle Alexander the new Jim Crow book, and this is for a $100 donation. Talking about Jim Crow today. Jim Crow is actually happening today, right now. You probably don't even know about it. So if you take time to go to your phone, pledge your support, you not only get the book, but you get the companion talk recorded in the Bay Area by Michelle Alexander. If you haven't heard it, it is ear-opening. And it tells you the truth about the facts of people of color, especially men, in the prison system and how they got there. I think one of the biggest things in life for a person of color, such as myself and maybe you or someone you know, is that you want to stay out the justice system. It's so easy to get caught up through a traffic ticket, turns into a warrant, they take your license, they jail you, because you can't afford it. You can't afford the ticket. 818-985-5735. The 5 freedoms are internationally accepted standards of care that affirm every living being's right to humane treatment. Freedom now. Freedom of speech and expression, peaceful assembly or association. 818-985-5735. Please call. We're down to the wire. We only have a few pledges. We're not even halfway to our goal, which is $1,000. Time is running out, and we are short a little bit over $500. Can you help us? That $100 goes a long way. Freedom now, freedom of speech. Freedom is a right. Freedom gives citizens basic freedom with respect to speech and expression. It's important to understand the scope of these provisions and any exceptions thereof. 818-985-5735. We are getting one pledge that's coming in. I just want to let you know about this Blues and Jazz Queens collection. You get, for a $160 donation called the Phone Room, Ella Fitzgerald Icon 2 CD set, Essential Nina Simone 2 CD set, Ken Burns Billie Holiday CD, and Etta James Best Of CD for a $160 donation. Thank you gift to you for pledging online at kpfk.org or calling 818-985-5735.
For KPFK Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Stuart Schrader, Associate Professor of History and Director of the Chloe Center for the Critical Study of Racism, Immigration, and Colonialism at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, and author of the book Blue Power, How Police Organize to Protect and Serve Themselves. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Stuart Schrader.
Thanks for having me.
So why did you produce this book?
Well, I think that over the past decade or two, we've gained a really good understanding of the history of policing, particularly with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Many scholars, journalists, activists have tried to make sense of how police operate in the streets and how they have repressed movements, enacted myriad abuses. But I think we've had less of an understanding of how police tend to operate behind closed doors and how frequently they actually get their way behind closed doors, oftentimes enabling those very abuses that many have criticized. And so I tried to understand how police developed political power in the United States. What are the sorts of tactics and methods that they use to get their way, how they have built on but also diverged from the labor movement, and how their political power has been changing in recent years as police unions have grown closer and closer to Donald Trump's MAGA movement.
How have they grown closer to MAGA?
Well, in part led by the Union for the Border Patrol of the United States. Police have seen the rise of Donald Trump as offering both tangible and intangible rewards. Of course, the Border Patrol Union was one of the first unions to endorse Donald Trump when he ran in 2016, and they've gained quite a lot, and particularly the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in terms of material rewards. But I think Trump has also offered something more immaterial in terms of just a widespread sense of relentless, full-throated support for police, for a kind of law and order politics, and a refusal to sort of back down in the face of criticism. Trump, in some ways, has modeled the very types of demagogic politics that many police union leaders themselves have aspired to.
So, what are the origins of police unions, cop associations, etc.?
Well, the history goes back quite a ways to the beginning of the 20th century, and I mainly focus on the period from the 1960s to the present. But most police associations started out as kind of social clubs. They were not really very close at all to the labor movement. They had a different trajectory. And then in the 1960s, as the public sector unionization movement took off, in large part supported by the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, state after state changed their laws and policies allowing public sector unionization. Police rode that wave of new union rights. But this was, of course, at the same time as there was a lot of social upheaval and turmoil in the United States, and police were also rejecting the civil rights movement and certainly the Black Power movement. They found the argument that criticized police obviously highly objectionable, and so they kind of married their push for better compensation and other types of workplace rights that any kind of union would advocate for. They married that to a really strong political argument that was rejecting some of the social change happening in terms of equality and freedom, and especially protection of criminal suspects and the rights of the accused and so forth.
How does Los Angeles and/or California fit into your story?
California actually has a pretty interesting role in the story. I don't spend too much time on LA, but I do look closely at San Francisco. And in San Francisco, the Police Officers Association became much more militant. It had existed for a while, but it became much more militant at the beginning of the 1970s when a kind of younger generation of cop started to gain influence within that association. And many of them had some progressive tendencies, in fact. Some of them were even anti-war, and they were also explicitly willing to have a kind of multiracial membership to the union. But they really wanted to overturn the way that the police department had been operating in terms of seniority structures and patronage networks. And they wanted what they called a kind of fair opportunity for for advancement for the younger officers coming onto the force. They then saw an increasing push for affirmative action that was coming from newly hired black officers or officers or recruits that wanted to become officers. They saw that as a new form of kind of patronage, and so they opposed affirmative action. And so all of these dynamics became quite complex, and there were lawsuits. But ultimately, the really interesting part about the San Francisco Police Union militants is that they figured out that they could gain power by going to Sacramento. If they couldn't get their way in the city of San Francisco, they would go to the state capitol, and they developed close relationships with elected officials in the state capitol. And that became a strategy that many other police unions and associations across the country started to adopt.
Now, do these police unions in the Golden State have any association with the prison guards unions, which have a considerable amount of political power?
Yeah, I think that the prison guard unions have been extremely powerful, and the police unions have, in some cases, learned from them, and probably the prison guard unions have learned from the police unions. They've operated on somewhat parallel tracks, but they have kind of different situations, because for the most part, the prison guards are state employees, whereas the police are city employees, but they use the state legislature to get around some of the impediments they encounter at the municipal level.
What has been the response of police unions and associations to the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, one effect of the Black Lives Matter movement was to empower police reformers, police chiefs, intellectuals, and others who made the argument that the problems of policing could be fixed through new types of training, new technologies, and so forth. And certainly the Obama administration really supported that argument. So at first, the Black Lives Matter movement empowered a kind of upper level stratum of police leaders. But the police union movement mainly consists of the rank and file, the patrol level officers. And throughout the history that I examine in this book, there's been a constant internal battle between reform-oriented, upper-level management of police departments and the more irascible and cranky rank and file. And so that kind of internal battle played out once again in the response to the Black Lives Matter movement. There were pushes for reform, and there was recalcitrance among patrol officers who didn't really want to engage in some of the reform practices or be required to take new types of training and adopt new technologies and so forth. So some of the dynamics of how the police have responded to Black Lives Matter fit a familiar pattern that I found throughout the past 50, 60 years in my analysis. And when Trump came along as a candidate who really rejected the claims of Black Lives Matter, again, many of these police union officials saw something in him that they could assert a kind of new voice, a new kind of national project of rejecting liberal reformism, rejecting progressive ideas, and sticking to their guns that police should be the experts on solving the problems of crime and disorder, and civilians and certainly intellectuals and social movements should have no say over how policing operates.
What do you mean by authoritarianism from below? And should we infer that there's a connection between this authoritarianism from below and the rise of police unions and a concomitant rise in police brutality?
Well, I used the phrase authoritarianism from below in an article I wrote for the New York Review of Books, which was trying to make sense of how police have reacted to the takeovers of cities by the Department of Homeland Security over the past year. In fact, although many police chiefs and mayors were in opposition to these takeovers, many local police union officials actually supported them. They saw in these takeovers an opportunity to take on their progressive antagonists on the local city council or in the mayor's office. And so I think a lot of the conversation about authoritarianism in the United States as it pertains to Trump has been fixated on measures that have been implemented from the top in the White House or in various agencies of the federal government. And I think there's been less attention paid to these sort of smaller scale institutional nodes of authoritarianism and even fascism. And as you well know, there's a long-standing critique within the Black radical tradition of making arguments about the police, prisons, jails as being the kind of locus of American forms of authoritarianism or even fascism. And so I'm trying to pick up on that political thread and show how it persists into the present with police unions and other types of police organizations.
I take it that the major gender issue involved in your study, Stuart Schrader, are gender issues involving masculinity, toxic masculinity in particular. Is that the sum and substance, or are we missing something?
Yeah, I think that's right. The book does show that, again, in the fights over affirmative action, there was resistance to including more women on the force in many cities. But one really interesting factor that I had no idea about until I began this research is the ways that in many cities, police officers' wives formed militant organizations that were able to get away with certain types of protests that police officers themselves couldn't. And so throughout particularly the 60s and 70s and even a little bit later, there were in city after city groups of police officers' wives who would picket City Hall, engage in public protests, find their ways to get quoted in the media, denouncing elected officials, denouncing police leadership, sometimes saying things that police officers themselves weren't really able to say because of departmental policies and other things like that. And so that was a kind of interesting and unexpected gender dynamic that I discovered in my research, and I think actually would be fruitful for other scholars to tug on that thread to learn more.
Well, Stuart Schrader, author of the book Blue Power, How Police Organize to Protect and Serve Themselves, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
818-985-5735. You are listening to Freedom Now with Dr. Gerald Horne. Gerald Horne is one of the most gifted and insightful historians on racial matters of this generation. When we talk about Dr. Gerald Horne, many of his books use an individual as a prism to inspect the historical forces of their times. Horne has also produced broad canvas chronicles of infrequently examined periods and aspects of the history of white supremacy and imperialism. For example, he has written on the post-Civil War involvement of the U.S. ruling class, slavery in Brazil, which was not legally abolished until 1888. He has also written on the historic relationships between African Americans and the Japanese in the mid-20th century, specifically examining the ways in which the Japanese state gained sympathy and solidarity from people of color by positioning themselves as the leaders of a global war against white supremacy. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, or pledge online at kpfk.org. You get your history lesson right here. It's like being in class. You learn so much, and there's no fee. That's the great thing about it, right? You can learn so much from KPFK. It's like being in a class. While some folks spend thousands on education, you get your education right here on KPFK. 818-985-5735, and go ahead and pledge at any amount and say, you know what, I've learned something. Let me give you guys $40. Let me give you guys $100. Let me give you a $250 pledge so that way someone could match that and we can make $500. 818-985-5735. Call that number And it's very special for someone to be on the mic and to historically take us back and take the time to tell us these facts, these stories about history that some of us want us to forget. But I don't really believe that. People criticize all the time on why we are bringing up the past. Well, if you don't know the past, you don't know the future. You can't repeat what has happened before, such as what Trump is doing now. He's repeating the past. All these dictators, all these oligarchs, the people that don't care about the middle class or poor, homeless, they're right now in office. 818-985-5735. Folks trying to make a better life for themselves, escaping abuse, escaping gangs, drugs, and they come here so they could be in solidarity with us and make this country a better place to live. We're trying. And if you're there, right there with us, thank you so much. We applaud you because we're one and the same, fighting the fight, fighting oligarchy. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. And some of the great Gerald Horne books that are out now that you can get are Black and Red, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Afro-American Response to the Civil War. How about Communist Front, the Civil Rights Congress, 1946 through 1956. Black Liberation, Red Scare, Ben Davis and the Communist Party. Fire This Time, the Watts Uprising and the 1960s. From the Barrel of a Gun, the United States and the War Against Zimbabwe, 1965 to 1980. Published on the University of North Carolina Press. Class Struggle in Hollywood, Moguls, Mobsters, Stars, Reds, and Trade Unionists, 1930 through 1950. Published by University of Texas Press. Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois. All great books. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Pledge your support for him writing Black and Brown, African Americans and the Mexican Revolution, 1910 through 1920, published by New York University Press in 2005. The Final Victim of the Blacklist, John Howard Lawson, Dean of the Hollywood 10, University of California Press. The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas After the Civil War. Incredible book. And each and every week, Dr. Horne gives us an insight from his books and history, U.S. American history. 818-985-5735. Mau Mau in Harlem, the U.S. and the Liberation of Kenya. The Color of Fascism, Lawrence Dennis. Racial Passing and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremists in the United States. The End of Empires, African Americans and India. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Or how about this? The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing. The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists, and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music. White Supremacy, Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa, From Rhodes to Mandela, put out by International Publishers, 2019. Dr. Horne is a treasure, and we learn more. And if you have not heard of Dr. Gerald Horne or this show, Freedom Now, tune in every Saturday from 11 to 12 p.m. How about this book? Black Revolutionary, William Patterson and the Globalization of the African American Freedom Struggle. Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba during Slavery and Jim Crow. Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary. Fighting in Paradise, Labor Unions, Racism, and Communists in the Making of Modern Hawaii. Published by the University of Hawaii Press. The Color of Fascism, Black Revolutionary. The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America. Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba during Slavery. Blows Against the U.S. Empire, Imperialism in Crisis, put out by International Publishers. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Call now or pledge online at kpfk.org. Back to the show.
For KPFK Radio, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line is Gautham Rao, Associate Professor of History at American University in Washington, D.C., and author of the book White Power, Policing American Slavery. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Rao.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book?
Well, this book is the product of a very lengthy period of time wrestling with the same topic. I started researching this out of an interest of a general question of why there were so many laws about the policing of enslaved people and free black people in the Old South, and that question only persisted as I realized the volume of the laws simply outstretched anything I can imagine. And I wanted to understand also why these laws had sort of gone under the radar when it came to both professional historians and public memory of slavery times. So it was a kind of twofold approach to this topic that led me to it and that sustained me through it. And of course, as current events seem to raise issues of racialized policing in the contemporary mind, they of course would weigh on how I was thinking about it as I was writing.
Mm-hmm. So how and why did the pro-slavery, anti-black policing regime spread throughout the nation? Give us an idea of what you're writing about.
Of course. The regime doesn't start off as a regime as much. It really is a solution to a classic problem in American history of labor shortages. And in this case, it's a public labor shortage because as enslavers are bringing captives through the slave trade into North America in the 17th century, quickly they realize that their own white vigilance is insufficient to keep their captives in place on the one hand, but also thinking about their own security as the white population, given that they have traumatized an entire group of people who may want to leave them or to self-emancipate or to fight back. And so it becomes apparent early that they just don't have enough on their own, plantation by plantation, to sustain these things. And so that's when they turn to the law. This is in about the 1640s and 50s for the first time, first in Virginia, and then we see it spreading. It's borrowed from places like Barbados, for instance, but first in Virginia, then spreading throughout South Carolina and the Carolinas. And eventually, as the territorial geography of the United States grows, this system grows with it. So the main realization here is that white vigilance alone is not going to be enough, although it has to be a significant portion of how these laws will operate. Things like pass laws, for instance, examining the written pass of an enslaved person in public space to ensure that they are where they're supposed to be and under supervision. But then the other side of it is when that's not enough, they need force and the ability to call on force in an instant. So we have things like slave patrols that generate over time, and then paramilitary outfits, rifle groups, they come to be called, and eventually militia detachments akin to what we think of as National Guard. So all of this, if one did a moving map starting on the East Coast with Virginia, you can see the slow creep of this over time. And by the time we get to the 1850s, I argue in the book that really the federal fugitive slave legislation of the 1850s is an attempt to nationalize the slaveholders' vision of a coercive criminal public law aimed at people of color. So that's really how we get from the 1640s to the mid-19th century. I also will suggest in the book that the system does persist, even though outside of the shadow of law, or rather in the shadow of law, through like things such as the vigilantism of the Klan and the White League, and then kind of the last gasp of the system is thinking about it through the lynching epidemic of the late 19th into the 20th centuries.
So, just to put a finer point on it, are you suggesting that the police regime nationally has its roots in this attempt to suppress enslaved Africans?
In a way I am, and in a way I'm not. And I'll give you as brief an explanation as I can on that. So, on the one hand, I think it's a misnomer to say that policing, the origins of policing lay in things like the slave patrol. I just think that is a stretch, because we did have policing institutions in the colonies, for instance, that were outside the context of enslaved labor, as an example. But on the other hand, I think that dismantling the system of white vigilance and white power that so characterized public law in the American South up until, as I suggest again, the 1880s and 1890s, it took a conscious dismantling of that approach to policing in order to come up with a professional model. And I think that has really gone understudied, the extent to which the white vigilantism and white power approach to policing enslaved people was an obstacle to the modernization of policing. Now, as I write in the book, though, it didn't mean, of course, that racism disappeared, but rather it simply moved into a more efficient form of policing, which is the uniformed, badge-wearing, baton-carrying, gun-carrying officer who has a beat, and then now, of course, with technological innovation, it's much different. But so, I do think there's significant intertwined stories here, but this isn't an origin story, I think, of modern policing.
Mm-hmm. What about the role of rebellions, activism, and fugitivity in your book? What do you have to say there?
The central current throughout the entire book is white fear. And that is both real and imagined fears, the kind of spectral fears of Black violence that so populated the white mind in slavery times. But of course, I think we could clearly see that that's a significant component of American culture today. So going back to the beginnings of the story up through the 19th century, the prospect of a runaway was a fundamentally damaging thing for a enslaver, because on the one hand, it really cut against their vision of manhood, right, which was all about the control not only of capital but of their own charges, of whom the family was one, but also enslaved captives were considered another. And so running away was really struck at the heart of the concept of manhood for white Southerners for much of the time period. But also beyond that, there was fear of rebellion and retribution. And so, we see these sporadic but incredibly powerful moments of Black rebellion. And I am a huge admirer of Vincent Brown's recent book on Tacky's Revolt, where he thinks about this as a kind of long-term warfare between enslavers and the supposedly enslaved. And so we see things like the Stono Rebellion becoming hugely influential, captivating the enslaver's mind. They keep going back to it, thinking about it. The Haitian Revolution becomes, of course, the real tipping point here. The idea of a Black Republic and Black Republicanism creates a sort of really amplified sense of fear among enslavers that will persist well through Reconstruction, and the fear, as they phrase it then, of so-called Negro rule, as they repeatedly say during Reconstruction, harkens back directly. So that is really the undercurrent, the connective tissue in the book is white fear. And if the book is titled White Power, it is power generated to address this pervasive fear of Black activism and revolt.
What about pitched battles going toe-to-toe between racist paramilitaries and enslaved rebels? What do you have to say about that?
The first thing I will say about that is that there were probably a great deal more than we know about. Having now studied at a fairly granular level the violence that that existed in battles between the enslavers and their captives, people who run away, people who self-emancipate. It is ever present, and so that's the general context here. In the book itself, I try to use those moments as poignant explanations of the stakes here. For people seeking not only to live free, but also to perhaps set an example of what's possible in terms of formerly enslaved people who are seeking refuge elsewhere. Those are battles for their lives and their legacies and progeny. And so in the book, I come to a couple. I'll give you a few short examples here. So I open with Stono, which is a story well told at the Stono Rebellion. But one thing that goes sort of understated in thinking about it is the extent to which enslavers react to that pitched battle by turning directly to the law. That becomes the immediate turn, and that's a trend we'll see over and over again. My favorite of the pitched battles happens in the 1850s in Pennsylvania, where we have enslavers descend upon the town of Christiana looking for supposedly runaway slaves, and find themselves up against a Black Vigilance Association, which has dedicated itself to not giving up anyone or allowing slave catchers to run through without first facing them. And what occurs is a sprawling battle that becomes a legal battle, and that really reshapes the face of American public culture. I think in my understanding of it, those battles over the fugitive slave law of 1850, which were pervasive and throughout parts of the country, I think are the tipping point from which there is no return in terms of a path to civil war in the United States. And so, the battles and violence underscore much of the book. I wish I was able to tell. Ultimately, this is a book about enslavers and their legal system, and so I wish I could have done more to tell even more of the stories of enslaved people and their allies who are fighting back with violence.
What about today? That is to say, how does the racist cops and the white vigilantes and the white supremacist militias groups et al., how do they all connect to slavery?
So I think one of the things that we have seen in our time is the fraying of what was a fairly well understood model of centralized government policing institutions, and rather we're seeing a moment now where people like sheriffs enjoy extraordinary authority, discretionary authority to both to devise policy, but also in terms of enforcement priorities. We've seen local law enforcement sign deals with punitive federal agencies like ICE. And that really harkens back to the system of the 19th century and 18th century, even into the colonies, where localities, popular majorities in localities exerted enormous authority over what the law actually was, and devised their own understanding of it. So in terms of direct connections between slavery and today, I would say those are a little tougher to discern, but if we're looking for the same kinds of patterns of enforcement that underscored the system under slavery times to the present, well, those are clearly there. For me, the key concept that was so operative back then and we're seeing again now is that of deputization, and the idea that when more force is needed, that can be generated almost instantaneously and rain down incredible power and violence upon those who are facing it down. So I think that's a particularly powerful example. We're also seeing through things like stand your ground laws that the idea of deputization need not be considered as an abstract thing or connected to sheriff's departments or things like that. In much of the country, one can, under the right of self-defense, use the concept of fear to justify taking a life, or at least a violent act of self-defense. And, that goes back to the prevalence of fear as a foundational cornerstone of the slavery policing system back in the 18th and 19th century. So there's certainly connections there, but overall, I do think the key factor is this general idea of force, deputization, being, seemingly throughout the 20th century fading a bit, and then all of a sudden now in the last 20 years we've seen a fairly sharp revival of their popularity.
Finally, Professor Rao, author of the book White Power, Policing American Slavery, we understand you're working on another project concerning the legal and constitutional history of the so-called Confederate States of America. Give us a snapshot of that project and perhaps how it represents possibly an extension of the antebellum laws and even reflections and ramifications today.
So this new project is really a spin-off of, I have a chapter in the White Power book about the Confederacy and what happens to slave policing laws during the Civil War. And the short version of that story is that they collapse because the very same people who are supposed to enforce them are the ones called to the front to fight the war. But it got me very interested in the nature of law in the Confederacy, given that it's founded as a sort of revanchist project attempting to have a kind of a 1776 version of what law should be. And the reality, despite the credos of freedom that are offered at the time of the secession and the founding of the Confederacy, the reality is that they come up with a very different understanding of what the law should be and what the relationship between citizen and state should be. And I'm arguing that this is a alternative to the rights-based liberalism that we tend to understand as the norm in American constitutional history. The idea that one is entitled to rights, the right to have rights. But in the Confederacy, it was different. It was very much a pick and choose approach to seeing who was able to enjoy those rights and what obligations one owed to the state in order to be chosen. And so that is a completely different understanding of constitutionalism and the law. I believe, I'm in the beginning stages here, but I believe that this is a running theme in American legal history going back into the colonies, and then one that, much like the slave policing story, maybe fades out of public view after the end of the Confederacy, but I want to suggest that because it was there and was so powerful, that perhaps some of the ghosts that we're dealing with in our own time today are owed back to that experience of the 1860s.
Well, we all look forward with eager anticipation to that project, Professor Rao, author of the book White Power. But thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much.
And in closing, we'd like to thank all those who donated this hour to keep Freedom Now on the air. Thank you to our guests, Gautham Rao and Stuart Schrader, our co-producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Brother Brandon, our board op Sly. Thank you, Gary Baca, and all those who made today's program possible. Stay tuned for our Brother Dino with the Signal coming up next. And until next week, signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage, and as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.